Maya, she barked, her voice a shrill accusation. Do you have any idea what time it is? I glanced at my watch. 8:30, I replied calmly. Is there a problem? A problem? Karen's voice rose an octave. A problem? You call this racket a problem? Racket? Karen, I'm playing classical music, and it's certainly not what I'd call blasting. It's loud, Karen insisted, her voice bordering on hysteria. It's disturbing the peace. I can hear it all the way over at my house. The soothing strains of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21 filled my living room, the notes dancing like moonbeams on a still pond. I leaned back on the couch, a glass of Chardonnay in hand, letting the music wash over me after a long day. This was my ritual, my way of unwinding, my personal symphony of serenity. Then came the pounding, loud, insistent, and utterly unwelcome. It rattled the windows, vibrated through the floorboards, and shattered the tranquility of my Mozart-infused haven. What in the world? I muttered, setting down my wineglass with a sigh. I padded to the door, already bracing myself for whatever fresh hell awaited me on the other side. As I swung the door open, I was greeted by the sight of Karen, my neighbor and self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood's peace and quiet. Her face was flushed, her eyes narrowed, her lips pursed in a disapproving frown. She looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon dipped in vinegar. Maya, she barked, her voice a shrill accusation. Do you have any idea what time it is? I glanced at my watch. 8:30, I replied calmly. Is there a problem? A problem? Karen's voice rose an octave. A problem? You call this racket a problem? She gestured vaguely towards the interior of my house, where Mozart's concerto continued to play at a perfectly reasonable volume. Racket? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. Karen, I'm playing classical music, and it's certainly not what I'd call blasting. It's loud, Karen insisted, her voice bordering on hysteria. It's disturbing the peace. I can hear it all the way over at my house. Karen, I said, trying to maintain my patience, I'm well within the local noise ordinances. It's not even 9 o'clock yet. Noise ordinances? Karen scoffed. Those are just technicalities. You're disturbing my peace. I can't even enjoy my chamomile tea with all this noise. Perhaps you could try closing your windows? I suggested mildly. Karen's eyes narrowed. Don't you get smart with me, young lady. I've had enough of your inconsiderate behavior. You need to turn that music down, or I'll be forced to take further action. Further action? I couldn't help but chuckle. What, are you going to call the HOA on me? Report me to the noise police? Karen puffed up her chest, her face flushed with self-importance. You just might find out, she threatened, wagging her finger in my face. People like you need to learn to respect the rules of this community. Rules? I said, my amusement fading. Karen, I'm not breaking any rules. I'm simply enjoying some music in my own home. Karen glared at me for a moment, her lips moving silently as if she were rehearsing a particularly scathing retort. Finally, with a huff of frustration, she turned and stomped back to her house, her parting words echoing through the quiet evening air. You'll regret this, Maya. Just you wait. I watched her go, shaking my head in disbelief. This was ridiculous. I had done nothing wrong, yet here I was being threatened with further action for the heinous crime of listening to Mozart at a reasonable volume. It was absurd, it was infuriating, and it was kind of funny. I closed the door, a slow smile spreading across my face. Karen had no idea what she had just unleashed. She had poked the bear, and the bear was starting to get angry. Very angry. Further action, huh? I muttered to myself, returning to my couch and picking up my wineglass. Bring it on, Karen. Bring it on. Karen, bless her obsessive heart, didn't disappoint. Her initial outburst was merely the opening salvo in a campaign of neighborhood terrorism that would make a dictator blush. She became a fixture in my life, a lurking presence always on the periphery, waiting to pounce on any perceived noise violation. I'd catch glimpses of her peering through her blinds, her face a mask of suspicion, a recording device clutched in her hand like a weapon. The faintest sound of music, a lilting violin solo, the rhythmic thump of a bass line, would send her scurrying out of her house, her phone glued to her ear as she dialed the HOA hotline, her voice a torrent of exaggerated complaints. "It's happening again," she'd shriek into the phone. That woman is assaulting my eardrums with her cacophony of noise. It's unbearable, unacceptable, un-American." The HOA, initially sympathetic, soon grew weary of Karen's incessant calls. Their responses became increasingly curt, their patience wearing thin. "Karen," the HOA president sighed on one particularly memorable call, "we've investigated your complaints. Miss Maya is not violating any noise ordinances. Perhaps you could try, I don't know, listening to some calming music yourself." Karen, undeterred, escalated her tactics. She threatened to call the police, painting a vivid picture of my house as a den of noise pollution, a haven for raucous parties and late-night revelry. The police, bless their weary souls, dutifully responded to her calls, only to find me peacefully enjoying a Beethoven symphony or a Bollywood dance track at a perfectly reasonable volume. "Everything all right here, ma'am?" the officer would ask, his eyes scanning my living room with a mixture of amusement and pity. "All right?" Karen would sputter, gesturing wildly. "Can't you hear that noise? It's an outrage, a travesty, a violation of my fundamental right to peace and quiet." The officer, with a barely concealed eye roll, would politely explain the concept of noise ordinances and legal decibel levels, leaving Karen fuming on my doorstep, her plans for a citizen's arrest thwarted once again. My frustration grew with each passing day, each frivolous complaint, each eye roll from the responding officers. But through it all, a spark of defiance ignited within me. I refused to let Karen, or the HOA, or anyone else dictate how I enjoyed music in my own home. The final straw came in the form of a formal complaint filed by Karen, demanding that the HOA issue me a hefty fine for my repeated noise violations. The HOA board, tired of Karen's antics and recognizing the absurdity of her claims, dismissed the complaint without hesitation. "Karen," the HOA president said, her voice laced with a hint of exasperation, "we appreciate your vigilance, but we must base our decisions on facts, not feelings. Miss Maya has not violated any rules. Perhaps it's time to let this go." Karen, of course, did not let it go. She stormed out of the HOA meeting, vowing to take matters into her own hands. I watched her go, a slow smile spreading across my face. She had no idea what she had just unleashed. If Karen wants a noise complaint, I muttered to myself, a mischievous glint in my eye, I'll give her a noise complaint she'll never forget. The time had come to fight fire with fire, or rather, noise with noise. It was time to turn the tables, to take back control, and to show Karen and the whole neighborhood that I would not be silenced. It was time for a concert. "If it's a noise complaint she wants," I declared, scrolling through my contacts list, "then it's a noise complaint she'll get." My finger hovered over the name Rex Rocker, lead singer of the local band Sonic Boom. A wicked grin spread across my face. This was going to be epic. Rex, bless his rock and roll soul, was immediately on board. "A concert to annoy a grumpy neighbor?" he bellowed through the phone. "Sounds like a gig we can't refuse." We settled on a date, a Saturday afternoon, prime time for maximum neighborhood disruption. "Make it loud," I instructed Rex. "Loud enough to rattle the teacups in Karen's china cabinet." "You got it, boss," Rex chuckled. "We'll bring the noise, the fury, and the pyrotechnics. Well, maybe not the pyrotechnics. Fire codes and all." With the band booked, I turned my attention to transforming my backyard into a concert venue worthy of a rock and roll rebellion. I rented a stage, a professional sound system, and enough speakers to make the windows vibrate in the next county. I strung up colorful lights, hung a disco ball from the old oak tree, and even invested in a fog machine, because what's a rock concert without a little dramatic haze? As I worked, I couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of Karen's reaction. I pictured her peering through her blinds, her face contorting in horror as the first strains of Sonic Boom's power chords ripped through the peaceful afternoon. I imagined her storming out of her house, her arms flailing, her voice a banshee wail of outrage. The image brought a warmth to my heart that no Mozart concerto ever could. "This is for you, Karen," I muttered, stringing up another strand of flashing lights. "This is for all the frivolous complaints, the exaggerated accusations, and the endless eye rolls. This is for making me feel like a criminal for enjoying music in my own home." I paused, surveying my handiwork with a satisfied grin. The stage was set, the sound system was ready to roar, and the fog machine was primed to unleash a hazy symphony of rebellion. All that was missing was the audience. "Don't worry, Karen," I whispered, a mischievous glint in my eye. "The whole neighborhood's invited. Except for you, of course. Wouldn't want to disturb your peace and quiet." The day of the concert dawned bright and beautiful, a perfect backdrop for the symphony of defiance I was about to unleash upon the unsuspecting neighborhood. My backyard was unrecognizable, transformed into a rock and roll oasis. The stage gleamed under the afternoon sun. The speakers stood poised like sentinels of sound, and the disco ball twirled, casting shimmering flecks of light across the expectant crowd. The entire neighborhood, minus one predictably disgruntled resident, had gathered. Mr. Henderson, decked out in a tie-dye shirt and faded jeans, was already headbanging in anticipation. Mrs. Peterson, her pink flamingo earrings swaying rhythmically, had set up a refreshment table laden with cookies and lemonade. Even Mr. Johnson, the timid HOA treasurer, was there, nervously clutching a can of soda, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "You sure about this, Maya?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Won't this upset Karen?" "Upset Karen?" I grinned, handing him a pair of earplugs. "Mr. Johnson, that's the whole point." As the clock struck 2, Karen's sacred nap time, Rex and Sonic Boom took the stage. The opening chords of their first song, a raucous anthem aptly titled Noise Complaint, ripped through the peaceful afternoon like a sonic boom. The crowd erupted, cheers mingling with the thunderous bass line and Rex's soaring vocals. I glanced towards Karen's house, a smug grin spreading across my face. Her curtains were twitching, a sure sign that the sonic assault had reached its intended target. A moment later, the front door flew open and Karen emerged, her face a mask of fury, her hair askew, her bathrobe flapping in the breeze. "What in the unholy—" she sputtered, her voice barely audible over the music. She stomped towards my yard, her fists clenched, her eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "Karen!" I called out, waving cheerfully. "Glad you could make it! Hope you like rock and roll!" "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with rage. "Turn it off this instant! This is a disgrace, an outrage, a violation of my auditory rights." "Sorry, Karen," I shouted back, grinning. "Can't hear you over the music. Maybe try these?" I tossed her a pair of noise-canceling headphones. Karen, defeated and fuming, retreated back into her house, slamming the door with a resounding thud. The crowd, witnessing her meltdown, erupted in cheers. "Encore! Encore!" Mr. Henderson yelled, pumping his fist in the air. "This is the best day ever!" a teenage girl squealed, dancing with her friends. Even Mr. Johnson, his initial nervousness forgotten, was tapping his foot to the beat, a hesitant smile playing on his lips. As Sonic Boom launched into their next song, a power ballad aptly titled Karen's Lament, I looked around at the joyous faces, the dancing bodies, and the shared sense of defiance. This was more than just a concert. It was a celebration of our newfound freedom, a middle finger to the HOA's tyranny, and a testament to the power of music to bring people together. Karen might have wanted peace and quiet, but I had given her something much better, a community united in their love of music and their shared disdain for her petty tyranny. And as the final chords of the concert faded into the warm afternoon air, I knew that this was just the beginning. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The music had awakened a spirit of rebellion in Willow Creek Estates, and it was a spirit that would not be silenced. Karen's emergence from her house was nothing short of spectacular. Picture a startled meerkat crossed with a furious teapot, and you're halfway there. Her face was a vibrant shade of puce. Her normally perfectly coiffed hair resembled a startled bird's nest, and her voice, oh, that voice, could curdle milk at 50 paces. "Maya!" she shrieked, her voice slicing through the joyous atmosphere like a rusty chainsaw. "What in the name of all that is holy is going on here?" I leaned against the makeshift bar, a margarita in hand, and surveyed the scene with amusement. "Why Karen?" I said, my voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Fancy seeing you here. Enjoying the concert?" "Concert?" she sputtered, her eyes bulging. "You call this cacophony a concert? It's an abomination, a violation of my peace, a crime against humanity." "Now, Karen," I chided, "let's not get carried away. It's just a bit of music, and it's well within the legal noise limits, I assure you." Karen's face contorted with rage. "Legal limits! Legal schmegel! This is an outrage! I'm calling the HOA!" She whipped out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with the fury of 1,000 typists. A few minutes later, the HOA president, a weary-looking man named Mr. Henderson, no relation to my rockin' neighbor, arrived on the scene. Karen, her voice a shrill torrent of accusations, pointed dramatically at the stage, the speakers, the dancing crowd. "Mr. Henderson," she wailed, "you must do something. This woman has turned our peaceful neighborhood into a rock concert mosh pit. It's unbearable, unacceptable, un-HOA-like." Mr. Henderson, bless his beleaguered soul, surveyed the scene with a sigh. He glanced at the noise permit I held up, checked his watch, and then turned to Karen with a weary smile. "Karen," he said, his voice a soothing balm in the midst of her manufactured chaos. "It seems Miss Maya has obtained all the necessary permits and is operating within the legal time frame. Perhaps you could, join the party?" Karen's jaw dropped. "Join the party? Are you insane? This is an outrage. I'm calling the police." And call the police she did. 2 officers arrived, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement. They listened patiently to Karen's frantic accusations, then turned to me with a questioning glance. "Everything in order here, ma'am?" one of the officers asked, his eyes twinkling. "Perfectly in order, officer," I replied, handing him a copy of the noise permit and gesturing towards the reveling crowd. "Just a neighborhood concert. Care to join us?" The officers exchanged a grin. "Don't mind if we do," one of them said, grabbing a lemonade from Mrs. Peterson's table. "Haven't heard a good rock concert in ages." Karen, witnessing this ultimate betrayal, let out a shriek of frustration that could shatter glass. She sputtered, she fumed, she threatened to write a strongly worded letter to the mayor, but her words were lost in the joyous din of the music, the laughter, and the cheers of the crowd. Her symphony of rage had reached its crescendo, and it was a glorious, cacophonous, and utterly satisfying sound. Sonic boom, fueled by the crowd's energy and perhaps a few of Mrs. Peterson's special margaritas, played like they were headlining a stadium show. The music poured out, a vibrant mix of classic rock anthems and original songs with surprisingly catchy lyrics about HOA tyranny and the joys of defying beige conformity. The neighborhood, once a picture of suburban sterility, throbbed with life. Mr. Henderson, his tie-dye swirling like a psychedelic vortex, had formed an impromptu mosh pit with a group of teenagers. Mrs. Peterson, perched precariously on a picnic table, led a sing-along to a particularly rousing rendition of "We Will Rock You," her pink flamingo earrings flapping in time with the beat. Even Mr. Johnson, his initial nervousness replaced by a wide grin, was swaying to the music, his can of soda replaced by a beer someone had thrust into his hand. "This is amazing!" he shouted over the music, his face flushed with excitement. "I haven't felt this alive in years." The party spilled out from my backyard, onto the sidewalks, and into the streets. Neighbors who had previously only exchanged polite nods over manicured lawns now danced together, shared food and drinks, and laughed with a genuine joy that had been absent for far too long. Karen's meltdown, meanwhile, had become a source of communal amusement. Her frantic calls to the HOA, her futile attempts to enlist the police, and her increasingly unhinged pronouncements about noise pollution and the decline of Western civilization were captured on camera phones and shared with glee. Memes were born, hashtags were trending, and Karen, the self-proclaimed neighborhood enforcer, became the unwilling star of Willow Creek Estate's latest viral sensation. The HOA, witnessing the joyous chaos unfolding before their eyes, could only watch in dismay. Their authority, once absolute, was crumbling faster than a poorly constructed gingerbread house. The rules they had so carefully crafted, the fines they had so readily levied, the beige conformity they had so ruthlessly enforced, it all seemed utterly meaningless in the face of the community's newfound unity and their shared love of rock and roll. "I can't believe this is happening," Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, muttered to himself, watching a group of teenagers crowd surf across a sea of inflatable pool toys. "It's like the neighborhood has been possessed by the spirit of Woodstock." But it wasn't Woodstock. It was something far more subversive. It was a rebellion, a revolution, a joyous middle finger to the forces of conformity and control. It was the sound of a community finding its voice, its rhythm, its collective soul. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that rivaled the flashing lights of my backyard concert, I knew that we had won. The music had done what no amount of logic or reasoning ever could. It had broken down the walls, shattered the rules, and brought us together in a way that Karen, the HOA, and their beige-tinted vision of the world could never understand. The neighborhood was rocking, and it was a beautiful, glorious, and utterly liberating sound. The HOA, wounded but not yet defeated, summoned its members to a hastily arranged meeting. The agenda? To quell the uprising, to silence the music, and to restore the sacred order of beige conformity. Karen, her eyes burning with a desperate intensity, presided over the gathering, her voice a mix of pleading and barely contained fury. "We must act now," she implored the assembled residents. This musical anarchy cannot stand. We must reclaim our peaceful neighborhood. We must restore order. We must ban unapproved performances." A hush fell over the room. The residents, many of whom had been present at the now legendary Rock and Roll Revenge concert, exchanged uneasy glances. They had tasted freedom, experienced the joy of community, and danced to the rhythm of rebellion. The HOA's desperate pleas for conformity fell on deaf ears. I, armed with a stack of signed petitions and a heart full of righteous defiance, rose to speak. "I understand your concerns," I said, my voice calm and measured, "but I believe this community needs more music, not less. We need more opportunities to come together, to celebrate, to express ourselves. We need more unapproved performances." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Mr. Henderson, the tie-dye enthusiast, nodded vigorously. Mrs. Peterson, her pink flamingo earrings swaying in solidarity, let out a whoop of support. Even Mr. Johnson, the timid treasurer, raised his hand in agreement. "But the rules!" Karen sputtered, her face contorting in frustration. "The covenants! The sanctity of our beige aesthetic!" "The rules are meant to serve the community, not stifle it," I countered. "And I believe the community has spoken." The vote was swift and decisive. The HOA's proposed ban on unapproved performances was rejected, and in its place a new motion was passed to officially recognize and support Maya's monthly music nights. My act of rebellion, once a thorn in the HOA's side, was now an official neighborhood tradition. Karen, witnessing the collapse of her carefully constructed world of rules and regulations, let out a strangled cry of defeat. She crumpled into her chair, her face a mask of humiliation and despair. The residents, once intimidated by her pronouncements and threats, now looked upon her with a mixture of pity and amusement. I resign, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She gathered her belongings, her shoulders slumped, her head bowed in defeat. As she shuffled out of the meeting room, a lone figure in a beige pantsuit, a wave of joyous laughter erupted behind her. The HOA's swan song had been sung, its reign of terror brought to an end by the power of music, the spirit of community, and the unwavering defiance of a woman who dared to turn up the volume and let the music play.